Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Scott Goodwin, and I'm an Assistant Vice President at the Global Financial Markets Association. As I mentioned, I graduated from the Flex MBA program last December. So first, I wanted to thank the Center for Social Value Creation. I should thank everyone who's still here, Nima especially for meeting with us today. Hopefully this will catch me here, so I don't actually have to hold it. Just for your awareness, for background on Global Financial Markets Association, we represent the common interests of the world's leading financial and capital markets participants to provide a collective voice on matters that support global capital markets. We also advocate on policies to address risks that have no borders, regional market developments that impact global markets, and policies that promote efficient cross-border capital flows to end users. GFMA connects savers and borrowers, thereby benefiting the broader global economic growth. And then our three member organizations are the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, the ASA, which is AFME, ASIFMA, which is the Asian Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association based in Hong Kong, and then the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association based here in DC as well in New York. Today, I'll be speaking about our recent report from October 2021 on unlocking the potential of carbon markets to achieve global net zero. This report was developed based on research and interviews with contributing member firms of ours, which include Bank of America, Barclays, BNP Paribas, Citi, HSBC, Morgan Stanley, Mizuho, MUFG, NatWest, Nomura, RBC, Standard Chartered, UniCredit, and Wells Fargo. And this was all done during the third quarter of 2021. It was also done with input from other market participants, climate science advisors, capital markets exchanges, and law firms with particular expertise in this area. The recommendations of this report are intended to promote a significant expansion in the scope and coverage of global carbon markets and to address low coverage of global greenhouse gas emissions by regulated pricing mechanisms, low carbon prices, and a rapidly depleting carbon budget. Just before I begin, I wanted to mention two other reports that we've done in partnership with BCG. The first being Climate Finance in the Real Economy, which was published in December 2020, where we looked at a bunch of different sectors and how they could transition to net zero by 2050. And we recommended that there were $3 to $5 trillion of investment per year in order until 2050 to reach those goals. In our second report, Global Guiding Principles for Developing Climate Finance Taxonomies, this report identified 5 principles that can be used globally for existing and new climate finance taxonomies. The report on carbon markets that I'm speaking to today builds off the findings of these two reports, specifically the first report on the amount of investment needed to reach net zero. I'll just use this. There we go. So just for an overview of this report, the report provides an overview of carbon markets ecosystem, highlights key challenges, and outlines recommendations for policymakers, market participants, and other key stakeholders to promote deep and liquid carbon markets while highlighting key enablers and dependencies. It serves 3 purposes: to create greater awareness on the need for carbon pricing and the use of carbon markets and their market structure, providing a summary of the current state, leveraging key data, insights, and findings. It's also to establish a vision for the future of carbon markets and provide a set of recommendations to achieve this vision from a practitioner's point of view. And since we were kind of cut off a little bit, I'm just going to skip over some of these key messages because I'll get into it as we move along. So just give a little bit of context, I want to give an overview of the carbon markets. So climate change poses a significant economic, financial, social, and environmental risk globally. And to mitigate these risks, the 2015 Paris Agreement aims to keep global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius, which it was before pre-industrial levels.
I'm gonna stop you.
Okay.
For 1 moment. You're going a little fast for me.
So yeah, I know. Sorry.
I know the time and whatnot, but I think this is really good information. It's okay if you slow down.
Okay, sure. So
this is good stuff.
Yeah, no. All right, I can slow down a bit. So the Paris Agreement, which some of you may have run across in your studies, is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius over until by 2050, and gradually lower the amount of, so to keep it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to do this, just as a little bit of context, we look at the state of carbon emissions today. And so this is from 2019, I don't have the latest information, but we estimate that 53 gigatons of carbon dioxide are emitted across the global economy, the vast majority of them being in power, industry, and transport. So each of these little boxes represents specific industry, and then we broke this apart by sector. So the largest emitter overall would be coal with 11.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide. I'm not quite sure, these aren't the latest, so I'm not sure if any of these have changed over the last couple of years, especially with COVID. But due to further support, all the information was all the information I'm presenting is based on the research that we did for the report. And now, in order to capture these and put a price on these to promote reduction in how much carbon dioxide is being emitted, there's coverage by the compliance markets, and compliance markets means that they're set up by the government. So these are emissions trading schemes. So in this figure here, on the y-axis, it looks at a share of a region's greenhouse gas emissions covered within one of these emissions trading schemes. And then on the X, that was the y-axis. On the x-axis, it is the region's global greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, there's a lot of gray space out there. So most of the carbon emissions aren't being captured by these schemes. So close to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions are not covered by regulated carbon pricing today. And then in the regions themselves that do have these, so the EU has a very popular one that we think of, the UK as well, but many other countries have these, and some states in the US have these. Most of these cover below 40% of their overall carbon emissions. And then, so to give an overview, there's also something called, so I showed you kind of the compliance market, just to give a high level description of what this is that a government steps in and sets an allowance on how many gigatons basically, or tons of carbon dioxide are allowed to be emitted totally within their market. This can be done through an allowance auction where corporates can bid on these allowances, or they can be distributed evenly based on the size of the corporates or the corporates overall. So if you see the regulator there is the one that's setting these out. And then there's what are called covered entities. They're covered under the system. They're the ones that either receive them or purchase them, and they use those to cover any of the carbon dioxide emissions that they have. So once they reach their cap, let's say they have 10 gigatons, just making something up, they reach 10 gigatons, they have to either purchase more or they have to stop emitting. And then trading is done, and this was created in markets. A lot of the markets have financial sector included as part to help create liquidity in the market, and then amongst the corporates themselves. So that's what drives up the price. So this is one example of how we want to break down carbon emissions. Another way, which we inside of a compliance system, is the carbon tax. This is my personal opinion. I think it's less useful because you're not actually capping how much carbon emissions there are. However, you can create a really, really high tax to reduce incentives to make it too expensive to continue emitting. And then the voluntary carbon markets, that is where there are buyers that voluntarily purchase what are called carbon credits, and they're issued and verified by a third party. It's certification bodies, and they represent a single ton of emissions avoidance, which is estimated versus a baseline that of who is avoiding the emissions, or you're purchasing a credit for something that's being removed from the atmosphere. So rather than being avoided, it can be removed. Removal is less. There's less of that today because we don't necessarily have the technology to remove carbon very efficiently. But in this system, you'll see that there's a product developer, they're at a corporate, they're going to be avoiding carbon emissions. They won't count the reduction in their own carbon emissions, but they can sell the avoidance, so the difference between what they were producing and what they weren't, to a corporate. In some industries, you'll see this would be helpful for because they simply don't have a business model to run on, where they can reduce their carbon or eliminate their carbon footprint. Think of like aviation with current jet fuel. And then these credits are purchased by corporates and financial institutions and traded, but a lot of times whoever purchases them will hold on to them for the long term. So here we'll see in the compliance markets in 2021, there were 29 emissions trading schemes that we captured with 8.7 gigatons of carbon dioxide estimated, which is only around 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it represents around $170 billion absolute market value as of 2021. And then around 275 billion was traded in 2020. And then the voluntary market is much smaller. There were only 100 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions retired in 2020 with an estimated market size of less than a half billion. However, it was on track because this report was finished before the end of 2021 at over $1 billion. For more context, there's also the pricing in compliance markets. So one of the main recommendations of the report that I was going to hit before I skipped, because I want to make sure I get a chance for questions at the end, is that the global average regulated carbon price is less than $5 a ton of carbon dioxide in most schemes. And most of the schemes today are below $40 a ton of carbon dioxide. Our report finds in order to meet what we're going for, you have to have an estimated price of 50 to 150 tons of carbon dioxide by just 2030. And that number is expected to continue to go up over time as we continue to try to reduce the total greenhouse gas emissions. On the axis here, you'll see the list out of all the different compliance systems in place. A lot of these are carbon taxes, which is the darker green, which I mentioned that sets an implicit price on carbon because it's not done via market trading, but it can reduce based on disincentivizing. And then the emissions trading scheme price is the lighter green. You'll see as you get further along, especially with some of the Nordic countries, the price is higher in the range that we're looking at, but the vast majority of these are below that 50 to 150 threshold that we're looking for. And then also speaking to this, something that's done is scenario analysis to see there's different scenarios that are put in place by global standard setters, regulators, think tanks that look at, where do we have to, based on our actions, what's the target temperature that we're going to get to? So you can see here on the far right, if the ambition is to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius per year by 2050, which is the Paris Agreement, or slightly more at 1.8, what would the price for that be? And these different lines here are all different scenarios that are played out. So the very top one says by 2050, we need $801 per ton of carbon dioxide estimated. And that's through what's called the Network for Greening the Financial System. Smith, I do not believe, is involved with this, but the School for Public Policy here at Maryland helped develop the scenarios. So that, for the students here, that may be something, if you're interested in this topic, going to check out the School for Public Policy to see if anyone's involved in that space. And the way that we came up with the estimations for our report, where we took a bunch of these different scenarios and kind of created an average of them, which is why you'll see at 2030 here, it's around 150 to 150 is kind of where the middle of those different lines are, and these change over time.
I have a question.
Yep.
Could you clarify why it is that the price of a ton of CO2 is going up or should go up in order to meet targets?
Sure. So in order to meet the temperature target that we need to drastically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's being pumped into the atmosphere. So every year, the compliance carbon market, what happens is they reduce the amount of allowances that they put into the market. So today, let's say I'm just going to give a number. Let's say there's a out of 100, there's 100 carbon allowances. By 2050, there may be 5 to 10. So the price of those allowances, if they're in high demand, will be significantly higher. Now, if the entire economy has transitions, then maybe they're not needed as much and they won't be as high. But maybe there's other facts, maybe there's a carbon tax or something else to continue disincentivizing that would get that price up to that higher level. But that's a great question. Any other questions on this? And I'll continue to touch kind of on these topics, how they're interrelated. There we go. So the gentleman that was speaking here before me, I just found out, helps run this, which is the Science Based Target Initiative, which they set pathways into achieving what is called net zero, whereas the amount of carbon that we release into the environment is neutralized. So, and he may have a different definition, but it's the simple. He said they came up with a new one in the last couple of weeks or months. But it's basically we're capturing the same out of the atmosphere than we are emitting. And so in this chart here, what you'll see is that the compliance market is what will be driving down the emissions, and the green is the greenhouse gas emissions. And on the bottom side is the voluntary carbon markets, which are used to reduce what you are emitting as a company or removing it itself. And the SBTi has 3 different pathways for companies to reduce the carbon that they're emitting. So the first is reducing emissions within your own value chain. I believe this is typically what you would call the greenhouse gas initiative, your scope 1, the emissions that you create as the company yourself. So if you're reporting on this, you can reduce this through a compliance market over time. Where the voluntary carbon market comes into play is that they're able to either use compensation to kind of negate what you're doing in your emitting while you have to do that yourself right now. But then eventually one of the goals is to remove carbon dioxide itself from the atmosphere, which is the blue here, which is carbon removals. There currently isn't really a product that is set up like that. There isn't much technology available at the time. But if you do, and I'll show this later, look at the carbon, if you look at the Paris Agreement and the targets, the amount of carbon that's expected to be removed from the atmosphere gets higher and higher each year as the emissions go down, because they want to continually prevent warming of the planet. So the bottom piece is what is primarily supported by voluntary markets, and the top is those emissions trading schemes and the carbon tax on the top. And here, this is a little more complicated, so I'll try to describe it. But this is a framework to expand coverage of companies of greenhouse gas emissions under both of these types of markets. So this larger rectangle that you'll see here, this is the compliance market, and then the smaller rectangle on the right is the voluntary carbon market. And as you'll see, kind of like it gets smaller and smaller on the far left. Those are different industries that we talked about, or that I showed with those boxes. That it's easier to capture the amount of carbon in one of these markets because it's easy to verify how much they're emitting, and then also reduce it over time. And then from left to right, the ease is typically, and this came up in the discussion before, if anyone was here, larger corporates have the resources, because this can be very expensive, to track their carbon emissions. And that's why a lot of this is done through public companies. So public companies that have reporting requirements. I know there's a speaker on this topic previously, but with the reporting requirements, larger companies have the resources to capture those. Whereas smaller companies, it may be, and especially in sectors that aren't carbon intensive, or they rely not specifically on carbon that they emit themselves, but up and down their own value chain, it can be really difficult to capture this. So that's where the voluntary carbon markets play an initial role, is that they are able to purchase either credits or if available, removals from the voluntary carbon markets before they're kind of captured by the compliance market itself, especially if that's for the larger corporates. And that's why you see these arrows going out. The goal is to expand the coverage of the carbon markets so that the entire global emissions are captured under that scheme. Whereas today, as I said, it's only around 20%. So the goal is, as we try to, decrease the global warming and decrease carbon emissions, we have to, in order to do that, we have to make sure that the carbon emissions are captured. Because if they're not captured, then you're going to have potential companies that are emitting carbon dioxide that they're not going to face the price challenges or the externality of what they're doing. So some key challenges, and I touched upon some of these for doing this. First is that there's low coverage of the market. So you saw in that rectangle, most of it was not included. Price levels are extremely low. So if we're trying to get to $50 to $150 a ton, and right now we're at less than $5, we're ways off, obviously. And then decarbonization ambitions of regulated carbon pricing aren't necessarily there. So, companies may not have the ambitions to reach these goals, especially if they're not mandatory. A second piece is the credibility of the existing voluntary carbon market. So one of the issues with these credits that are created is that if there isn't kind of a standard setter or a global governance body, who's to say what is actually removing carbon from the environment? Or if a project that you're doing is reducing your carbon footprint. So there has to be some sort of standards where you can do verification, measurement, and reporting so that you know that these contracts are legitimate and that they can be traded easily, and you know that you're actually, there's something called additionality, which I mentioned, is that you're not double counting. So the company that's that's giving out the credit is counting the credit towards themselves, and then they sell it to someone else, and they're not, and then they're also counting that. So those are some of the issues out there with the voluntary carbon markets. There's a task force, I forget what it's called, it's the TSVCM, I forget exactly what it's called, but they're a private sector group that's pushing for this, and they have asked global standard setters to kind of set some of these things in place. A third issue is both compliance and voluntary markets remain fragmented, which leads to inefficiencies in decarbonization in smaller, less liquid markets. So the compliance markets themselves, the word fragmentation means that when you're talking about fragmented markets, it means that you're not really able to have the same activity in one market and attribute it to another market. So if you have, and carbon emissions are global, right? So if you have an allowance in the EU, can't sell that allowance into the UK. But if there's actually a global cap and these markets are working together, you would be able to have the markets have exchanges or trade across these markets. And then the voluntary markets, because they're not mature as of now, and I said there's the credibility piece, that's where it can be that you can't buy an allowance or you can't buy a credit and then put that towards your allowance, right? Because if you buy a credit and you say, look, I'm reducing my carbon emissions, that doesn't matter for you don't get more allowances for that because those markets aren't interchangeable. The fourth piece is that carbon removals are necessary, but the market mechanisms remain unclear. So as I said, this is very necessary, and I'll show in a couple slides that they're absolutely needed to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. However, we don't have the financial products to trade on when we're removing carbon because they're not standardized. This could be done in the voluntary carbon markets, but there isn't really like a standardized financial product out there or contract out there for the carbon removal. And then lastly, lack of standardization of certain dimensions further limits scale and liquidity of both compliance and voluntary markets. So again, this is just, without having standardized markets where global standard setters help create standards that help, all types of markets function properly. Without standardized products, there's less liquidity in these markets. So if you are trying to purchase, let's say there is a credible a credible credit, it may be difficult to do so because the market isn't liquid. Someone is holding on to it, and then they're holding on to it until it expires. So there's difficulty there, and then you're not able to trade amongst the compliance market itself. So just to highlight some of these pieces, this goes to the emissions of the carbon removals. We took greenhouse gas emissions and normalized them on a 100-point scale. So 100 is the total today, and then reducing it over time to 2030. And we looked at what the projections are for the emissions in order to receive 1.5 degrees Celsius. So if you can see that I think it's pink or red, that dashed line, that is a group called the IAMC's, what they project we need to be at in order to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius by our 2030 date. And as you can see, there's only 2 carbon markets that are under that line at the moment, or at the publication of this report. So the UK carbon market and the EU proposed carbon market, which is in place now. But the other ones here that we use as examples aren't reaching that goal. So even if the market's been established, the allowances that are put in place, the amount of allowances, aren't significant enough, or there isn't scarcity enough of them, I guess would be the term, to achieve that goal. The next challenge, and this is what I want to hit for the carbon removals, is by 2050, we're going to need around 10.5 gigatons of carbon removed from the atmosphere annually, and that's the level that we need to be at that year. If you see all the way to the left, 2020, we're about 0.5 gigatons annual removed as the estimate. And we're going to have to increase that dramatically to 8.8, or I guess 10 is the actual figure. But as you notice, that continues, right? And it continues to increase too. So if you look at Paris Agreement goals, they're expecting that number, we're going to continue to bring carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it kind of does level out a bit, but it's going to have to continue to happen. So all this gets to the vision in our report for what the carbon markets have to look like along these different milestones in order to be on track to hit the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I won't go through all of these boxes, but on the left, we have topics of importance, which include policy-based coverage of global greenhouse gas emissions with regulated mechanisms, so compliance markets, aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition, a robust global voluntary carbon market with the high quality credits. And I do want to emphasize that it's very important that these credits are of high quality, so that we know they're legitimate. And then scaling market demand and improved market maturity. So so that different corporates are going to want to buy these products. They're able to measure their carbon emissions. There's going to be demand for it, and then there's going to be the liquidity that's available in the short term. So 1 to 2 years. So we're halfway there with this report almost. I guess a quarter of the way here. It's October. The medium term, 5 years. Long term, 10 years. And then that final end state goal of where the market needs to be in order to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And then we have the recommendations that are in place to bring on these key challenges, as well as to support the vision of the report. So first, we recommend that policymakers and regulators expand the scope of geographic, sectoral, and activity coverage of compliance emissions trading scheme markets and strive towards near full coverage by one or more greenhouse gas pricing and/or greenhouse gas control mechanisms within the next 5 years, so 4.5 at this point. High impact emissions trading schemes, stringent allowance reductions aligned with emissions pathways that achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius ambitions. So as previously mentioned, it's expanding the scope of the carbon markets, but along with that, having the ambitions in place to hit those targets. So that thick line being at it or below it. So reducing the amount of carbon emissions allowances that you have in the market. Second is that we recommend that standard setting bodies in coordination with the broader ecosystem facilitate the transformation and scaling of the voluntary carbon market to ensure the integrity, role, and additionality. So as I mentioned, one of the key challenges is that the voluntary carbon markets doesn't necessarily have the credibility that it needs today. Standard setting bodies, such as maybe the International Sustainable, the ISSB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standard Setting Board, or the Financial Stability Board, or whoever it may be, steps in with the broader ecosystems of corporates, auditors, et cetera, and make sure that those credits are legitimate and we can create a robust market in that. Third, is we recommend that policymakers and regulators over time enable selective interoperability among compliance markets with similar ambitions to permit the use of limited quantities of high qualified, verified DCM credits in compliance markets after their credibility and additionality are established. So the first piece of that is that we want to make sure that those compliance markets aren't fragmented so that they operate together. One piece that's important for that, though, is that they have to have similar ambitions to start in order to have interoperability. But eventually, the goal would be to have global interoperability between all of these markets. And second is that a limited amount, because you don't want to have these offsets drive the majority of what you're considering emissions reductions, because at the end of the day, you actually have to reduce the emissions. You can't just have some projects that reduce it and have other corporates continue to emit. But having the ability, especially for those sectors that don't have the ability right now, but they may have in 5, 10, 15 years to reduce their carbon emissions, to buy those credits so that they are able to at least offset some of what they're doing. So that's that piece there. And then our final 3 recommendations, the fourth is, excuse me, we recommend that market participants, infrastructure providers, policymakers, regulators, standard setters, and climate science bodies drive standardization of carbon market products, accounting, and legal frameworks, and develop best practices for regulating both carbon markets and associated trading activities for allowance, credits, and derivatives. Did I rush it? Okay. So to get the gist of it, the entire ecosystem, the entire financial markets, and all the players there have to be working together to achieve this goal. Data needs to be available, standards need to be in place, ambitions need to be in place, and the financial products, there need to be financial products available for the different types of corporates and their needs. So that doesn't mean just these credits, but maybe there's derivatives based off of these, just as an example. The fifth piece is we recommend that as a key enabler for carbon markets, leading climate science and standard setting bodies develop a universal carbon accounting framework that includes policies for measuring and reporting scope 1 through 3 emissions across different sectors and drives consensus on nomenclature and the definitions of claims such as net zero and carbon neutral. So some of this is being looked at now since the publication of this report. So what I'm saying may not be reflective of the report or my company or my members. But the SEC, I know there was a speaker earlier talking about disclosures, and a piece of that is how much carbon that you're emitting. And it goes across the different types of the emission scoping. So scope 1 through 3. 3 is often argued the hardest, and you'll see that at the SEC, something that's being argued against is it's very difficult to measure what your carbon emissions are up and down your value chain. I'm not an expert in that area, so I won't say if that's the case or not. But I know some of the speakers there, speakers today would be, if you're at the reception, they would be able to answer that question better than me. But then the second piece of that is that, and so the SEC is doing that, and then there's what's called the International Sustainability Standards Board. And in some of your business classes, you may be aware that the US isn't on the same financial accounting system. So there's FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, or Federal Financial Accounting Standards Board here in the US. Public companies that report to the SEC use FASB standards, whereas everywhere else in the world uses the International Accounting Standards Board. There are some local ones, like the European has specific rules through a group called FRAG, but the IASB has created their own sustainability standards board, and they're looking at the same thing that the SEC is doing. And hopefully the standards that they set up globally and the standards that are in the US are also in harmony, because that can become difficult for companies that are operating in multiple jurisdictions. But that's an important piece that is being looked at now, and hopefully will be successful. And the nomenclature that we bring up here, such as net zero and carbon neutral, there has to be a standard definition for what that means, right? So if you're going to put in your marketing material, we're a net zero company, or we have a net zero target, that has to mean something. And the speaker that was here before from SBTI, that's why they have their new updated definition of what net zero is. So that a company can't just say, we're going to be a net zero company or we're a net zero company and not actually be doing that. And that's what you may have heard the term greenwashing is considered, is where you have all this marketing material, you have all these projects that say you're net zero, and then your other business line is the complete opposite, doing 3 times as much carbon emissions as you're removing on that one side. So having standards for those definitions and claims are important, especially for when these companies start doing reporting. And then the final piece, which is less of a recommendation, but something where I work in banking and capital markets, the firms that are reporting this paper say that they're supportive of these recommendations that I'm bringing up, and they're committed to building a suite of capabilities and product offerings for both the compliance markets and the voluntary carbon markets. And this is to help market participants address their compliance, decarbonization, investment, financing, and risk management needs, thereby supporting robust, competitive, liquid, and mature markets. Banks with their clients, they provide these services to their clients. If their clients are going to be doing these activities, the banks are going to want to be there hand in hand with them, helping support them with these ways. So they're going to want to help support with these recommendations, and they're also going to want to make sure that those financial products available, as I mentioned, with having derivative projects, et cetera, are available to them. So I'm not sure what time it is because that clock is way off. Sorry, that's kind of why I came out to the jump really quickly.
Yeah, 25.
I have 25 minutes.
You have like 5-10 minutes.
Oh, okay, perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. And thank you for mentioning that at the beginning.
Yeah.
If you guys have any questions, happy to answer.
I have a question.
Perfect.
So this seems like the wild, wild west with all these various different organizations. And this ecosystem that you keep mentioning, who's managing this ecosystem? And who do they report to when it comes to various different companies and various different compliance markets and this, that, and the other? How do you understand that?
Definitely, that's a great question. So there's a global perspective, and then there's the local perspective in these countries. From a global perspective, there are the global standard setters that help create the standards for these markets, help create the disclosure standards for these companies, that kind of kick it off. And then there's regulation that comes out on the back of that, where through the general policy process, where these things can be implemented. That from a global perspective. Then each country on its own, sometimes they adhere specifically to the global standard setter, US not as much because we have our own process. They do this locally where they create their own compliance markets. So you saw the list of all the different compliance markets. So at the last conference of parties, if you guys are familiar, it's the UN's climate change conference back October, November, right? I was on paternity, so I turned off my phone for a month, but they discussed how they could have interoperability between those markets, and that will be key. That takes a lot of work, and that takes a lot of these different jurisdictions coming to a consensus and agreeing on doing the same things. In the US, it's its own challenge because, as you saw, the US isn't listed, right, as having a carbon market. And how do we get there? Well, the way that we would get there would be, one way that we would get there is through legislation. We know how difficult it can be to get anything passed, unfortunately. But there are some states that have their own markets. So California is a big one. I believe Maryland has its own. I'm not as familiar with.
So you may have state markets involved in national markets.
So the state market can be interoperable with. It could be built. So California is such a huge economy, right?
Yeah.
And they're kind of doing this on their own. They could say, we have and sometimes companies leave as an example, but let's say the companies are staying, they have their emissions set. When California does that, it sometimes adds pressure to other states to do the same or to adopt the same system. So that's one way that you can see it happening. I don't know if we'll have a national one, but they can also build their market so that it's interoperable with, let's say, the EU. So at some point, maybe, hopefully the US is at that point, but let's say maybe the EU and California have companies where they can trade their allowances because the allowances themselves or the contract, whatever it is that's being traded, is similar enough where that interoperability between that market is there. I personally wish I knew how we would set up the type of market in the US. I think, and these are all just my personal views, but I think a first step is measuring carbon emissions. And once that measurement is available, maybe then there'll be more state markets, or there'll be a voluntary, the voluntary market will grow at least potentially in the US, because what's being done is captured. But no, that's a great question. It is kind of like a big soup, I guess, or a mess, like it's and dealing with, personally, I deal at the global level. I don't do a lot with the US itself, and trying to get to these standards and seeing how different markets are, form their rules. It's interesting, and it can definitely be very challenging. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm kind of new to the whole, net zero thing. I'm from a horticulture background, not a business background.
Oh,
So it's not
interesting.
a definitely an interesting question for you.
Are you
First
a
year
business
MBA.
student?
Yeah, first
Okay,
year MBA.
okay.
So when all these companies over the past year or two have been saying, we have a net zero target, are they able to claim net zero if they're buying these credits to offset, or do they actually have to reduce their emissions?
So I'm not 100% sure, because it's, like I said, it's not standardized, but I do think some of these companies are buying these credits to say they're net zero. But this is where you run into issues with the voluntary markets. Just as an example, is you could be buying a credit that says, we're planting 1,000 trees, or we're planting this many acres of forest, right? And then a wildfire comes in and takes them out, right? So now you're not really reducing your carbon footprint, but you have a contract that says it's now null and void. Do you get a replacement? How does that work? So there's difficulties there, but a lot of the industries that aren't able, because they're needed, right? Aviation is a good example. It's like, we need air travel. Maybe we need to limit how many people use air travel. Maybe we need to reduce the amount of flights, or have the most fuel efficient. You look at different fuels, but at the time being, like, if a plane's going to be in the air, it's going to be emitting. So the only way for them to reduce their carbon footprint would be to purchase those types of credits. And that's why it's so important that those credits are standardized, but we call it the MRV in the report. It's that they're measurable, they're verified, so by an auditor or some sort of outside group, and they're verified. So that's why it is important. You'll see, I mentioned our first report. We did look at all the, like, this is like right out of our first report, basically, or similar, is where we looked at each of these different sectors and then said, what's the pathway for them to get to that net zero at some point? And that's going to take a ton of investment for some of these sectors. And maybe some of these sectors become obsolete, I don't know, but there's a huge opportunity there, but we have to become serious about it, because if the and in our report, and I may have done it really quickly at the beginning, apologies, we estimate that $100 to $150 trillion of investment is needed if we're going to come close to those goals. Now, annually, $3 to $5 trillion isn't as much, but that's a huge amount, and the financial services plays a role, because if you're going to have that type of investment, you're going to have partnership with financial services. Both great questions, though. I don't know. If anyone has any questions about general sustainability too, like I'm not a carbon trader. This was just the last report we did, so happy to speak on anything else. But also, if we're finished, I can wrap up. But thanks so much, all of you, for coming and listening today.